This is the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Podcast, episode number 6.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. In today's episode, I talked to Trey Combs, who is one of the most influential people in the history of steelhead fly fishing. Trey gets into a bunch of steelhead topics and also talks about blue water fly fishing, goes deep into the steelhead history of flies, some of his biggest influences, and his upcoming new book. Trey gets pretty fired up in this one as he talks about the Thompson River steelhead issues that are occurring currently and how he documents this in his new book. So without further ado, here's Trey Combs. It's really great to have you on the show, Trey. We've been chatting here a while trying to get things set up, so I'm glad we had a chance to get this all ready to go. I have a bunch of questions here focused mostly around steelhead fishing, but I want to get into definitely some background on your history, because that was kind of the first time I heard a recent interview with you. You were talking a lot about some of the blue water stuff you've done, so I think that's really interesting, and I'd love to dig into that a little bit. So maybe you can just start us off with a little bit of your history, like as far as how you got going in fly fishing and steelhead fishing, and how you got to the place where you are today.
That's a big question. I was raised in my brother and I were raised in a Navy family, so we moved a lot. But my grandparents lived in Port Townsend, and I swore that I'd go back there and live one day, and that's where I went back, and after college went back and taught school there.
Huh.
And I've lived in Port Townsend for 40 some years, and I'm down here for a few years, and I'm going to probably go back and live in Port Townsend and maybe rent the house out I'm living in now. But there was never any doubt about where I wanted to live. And as a high school kid, I locked into steelhead, probably junior high actually.
Okay.
There was an old catalog. Catalogs were a big deal when I was a kid, unlike today, where everything's online. But Ashaway had a catalog, and there was these huge salmon-like fish that these guys were holding up. That was my first time I'd ever seen pictures of steelhead. And then I subscribed to every magazine, Outdoor Life, Sports Afield, Field and Stream, and I saw pictures of steelhead that like Ted Trueblood had caught. And that was before I actually was able to get out and settle in Port Townsend. So the idea that you have rainbow trout that average 7 or 8 pounds was just a mind blower. I grew up mostly in Virginia, and trout there were 8 or 9 inches long. So a trout that was 28 or 30 inches was just amazing. So it was kind of locked into that years and years before I ever actually saw a steelhead.
Wow, that's gosh. So you got going fairly early. I mean, junior high. Did you actually get out and did you get into steelhead fishing right away? Like as far as on the river after that?
Oh, when I got to Washington State, I couldn't get on the river fast enough. I was going to, as I said, I was going to college down there, and I knew who Jim Green was. Jimmy Green was tied in with Fenwick. At that time. He was the world's distance casting champion, single hand.
Right.
And before coming up here, I had called him down there, and I told him I was going to Washington State, and I was going to be mano a mano with these giant steelhead salmon. And he recommended a 9 or 10 weight rod, and I insisted on a 11 weight Fenwick. Was just insane, but that's what I came to Washington State with, was this stick, tarpon stick for steelhead. And I fished a Wetzel shooting heads. Had not a clue how to catch a steelhead. And I must have made 1 million casts before I actually hooked one.
And what year?
In case of the river.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, and what year was this, roughly?
When I was it'd be the late 1960s when I got to Washington State and began fly fishing.
Okay, perfect.
And I'd been doing research on steelhead as a sidelight to being in college, and I was teaching school down there on an emergency credential. There was a shortage of teachers in a barrio, Hispanic area, and I was still an undergraduate. In fact, I was just a junior, and I got an emergency credential from California and began teaching school as a certified school teacher as an undergraduate, which is kind of weird. But so I was already digging in and reading everything I could find on steelhead as a college student. So when I got to Washington, I was already headlong into a book on the subject. It's actually kind of be a history of Western fly fishing. As soon as I got here in Washington State, I headed out to the peninsula. And began fishing out there.
Gotcha. So those were the first rivers you really hit for steelhead, and probably the first place you got hooked your first steelhead?
First winter steelhead I got on a fly was on the Hoe.
Okay.
And I took two one morning. As I said, I'd made millions of casts, and I did not. The idea was that you had to get your fly down, and what the fly did after it got down, oftentimes the line was heading downstream ahead of the fly. Mm-hmm. Very typical. And there was a run, intertidal run on the lowest part of the Hoe. It was probably the last run that you could say that was fishable. It wasn't actually a pure intertidal area. And the lower Hoe is not very much river. It's in a tiny little reservation down there. And I came on this run down there, and the flow of the river was such that it mended the line for me. It was just a matter of throwing my shooting head out there slightly downstream, and the current was such that it just picked up the line, and the fastest current was against the bank, and it was a perfect swing by accident. Yep. And I took a jack steelhead and then a regular two ocean steelhead one morning. And I understood what had happened. The first summer steelhead came from the North Fork. Thanks, Jack. Jack just built me a cup of coffee and set us up here this morning.
You're good to go then.
Yeah, so I am good to go, Dave.
All right. Oh, that's great. I love this is pretty much the stories are what this show is about for me. Hearing this is awesome. Especially I've got a little piece on my website that's about kind of first steelhead stories, and one of them is my brother writes a story there that basically, I think the title is something like 13 steelhead lost, I quit or something like that. And he basically one year when he was first getting into it, he lost 13 in a row. And he almost gave up fishing, and pretty much he finally landed one. But it's like steelhead is just, that's kind of what it is, right? You kind of put your time in and eventually get these amazing moments. So
Deer Creek was a small feeder stream. In fact, back in those days, Puget Sound had runs of 1 year ocean fish.
Okay.
And they were a godsend. They were very trouty. They're free rising. A lot of the pioneers in Washington fly fishing all had cabins on the North Fork of the Stille, just below Deer Creek. And like Walt Johnson, and those fish were so trouty that you could take them on a drag-free dry fly without a waking dry.
Wow!
And we didn't appreciate back then what a remarkable race of steelhead we had in Puget Sound, and now they're listed. I think they're threatened. Yep. Maybe not endangered, but they're threatened. They're trying to rebuild stocks in the Puget Sound. I've really gotten into this on a new book that I'm working on. I've been working on it for several years now. Yeah. But the different races of steelhead is what makes the sport so magical. That Puget Sound had these 1 year ocean fish, which were 4 or 5. I think my first steelhead on a summer run on the North Fork of the Stille was, I don't think it was more than 5 pounds, 25-inch fish. Mm-hmm. And you've got half-pounder races down the Klamath and the Rogue and the Trinity and so forth. Yep. You've got out on the west end on the OP, you've got winter runs with the occasional 4 year ocean fish.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And in Canada, you've got discrete races. I'm kind of wandering here a bit, but I just finished a section of the book on kind of a historical part on the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds. And they have estimated that they have lost about 100, close to 100 discrete races of steelhead. There is no record of them. There's no life histories that are survived. The few fish that are left are all hatchery fish.
Yep.
And most of those fish, the DNA of those fish is mostly from the Eel River, because they use broodstock from the eel in their hatchery programs. So historically, there may have been 1 million fish, 1 million summer-run steelhead that came in the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds all the way up to the Feather and Yuba and American at the top. The Sacramento went all the way deep into Oregon. But all those races, I mean, they had to be as different as the other California races, where you have everything from half-pounder to a big eel steelhead that are probably 3-year ocean fish and weigh over 20 pounds. Nothing survives. There's not even a record of what was lost.
Yeah.
The gold mining and the hydraulics of hydraulic mining devastated those rivers. And before anybody could figure out what the hell was going on down there in terms of the steelhead population, they were gone.
Yeah.
They're just like, it's so sad. But anyway, go ahead with your questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was kind of wandering around there.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, because it's it's challenging. We're trying to recover these stocks, but we've lost a lot of the genetic history there. But so no, I appreciate that. I was kind of thinking, as you talked about your book coming up, is that going to be, do you have an idea, is that coming out this next year? Your recent book?
The writing of it should have been completed this year, and I did a move, and then I had some really difficult issues with the back, with a broken down back. I've got a surgery coming up this winter that will kind of get me rolling again. I haven't been able to wade out into a river because I'm on a lot of painkillers, and my back is busted down in a couple places. So I'm going to do a fusion on my lower back this winter, and that will be really helpful. But anyway, it's kind of a history book in a way, and but it's current. It's I'm desperately trying to keep it to 1 volume as opposed to 2 volumes, but it could run into 2. And if that's the case, I'm going to need, I'll have to go to some investors to get this thing rolling with. I've talked to Tom Perrow a lot about it at Wild River Press. He's a longtime friend of mine, and I greatly admire the books that he has produced. They're beautifully done. So, and I've also talked to Stackpole. So, but in fact, I spent yesterday banging emails back and forth with Tom Perrow about the plight of the Thompson River steelhead, which is just absolutely tragic what is happening. And I think they're gone. I think they're going to go extinct. Wow. But sadly, Wow. I could talk for an hour just on that subject alone. It's complicated. But the escapement this year, Pete Soverell, I read an email that he sent to Tom Perrow yesterday, and he thought that the escapement was 130 fish or 133, something like that. I'd heard 200. Yeah. And during the Depression, the estimates of the run has been 30,000. Yep. And I know why the fish are gone, but what to do about it? It's too late to hold a bunch of meetings and give up your fishing and stuff. It's the horse is out of the barn on that one. Sure. If the government will not step in and facilitate a Save the Thompson Steelhead program of some sort, then they're going to be lost. But anyway, Dave, I kind of spoke over the top of you. Go ahead with your questions.
Oh yeah, no. So I was just kind of on this track of your books. Maybe you can, for those that don't know you, I mean, I know you've obviously been around the fly fishing for a long time, but maybe you can talk about your kind of the first books you wrote, or some of the stuff that you kind of the popular books that you've done so far.
I wrote a huge long book, which is kind of the history of Western fishing, going back to the 19th century and the beautiful cane rods that were being built which were just a perfect match for our drift fishing, but they were used in the saltwater. But I took that to a publisher that Frank Amato had introduced me to, and the publisher said, this thing's got to be stripped down to less than half of this length, and you've got to concentrate just on the steelhead. So I did, and I took the book back to the publisher about 10 months. That's all I did for 10 months was edit this thing. And I was with Frank. We went in and talked to the publisher, and he just said, I don't think I'm going to do this. So Frank liked what I'd done and said, I'm going to publish this book. And it was the first book Amato Publications did. It was called the Steelhead Trout. Little book, 6,000 copies hardback. And my principal claim to fame in that book was, for the first time in a popular publication, we tracked the whereabouts of ocean steelhead. That was something that had never been done before. And I spent 6 months going through records by the North Pacific Fisheries Commission. Steelhead were caught in the high seas and given a latitude, longitude point, and then a date. And those records, they were listed as an incident. I listed all those places where they'd found steelhead. And then I began working with the University of Washington with a fisheries biologist there. And anyway, out of that came the ocean migratory habits of steelhead, which really is not governed by current, but it's governed by temperature. Steelhead are incredibly sensitive to temperature, right? Much more than Chinook salmon. So anyway, that book came out, but I'd left a lot on the table, and I was doing a lot of research on the history of the early steelhead flies. I had so much of that, I came up with a second book, and I used a lot of the same information, but essentially the second book, Steelhead Fly-Fishing and Flies, was the first book written about the pioneers in steelhead fly fishing going back to John Benn in the 1890s. Nice. The stagecoach routes that took people up on the eel and so forth. And Dave, I don't know how many printings that book went through.
Yeah. I'm
going to guess and say over 30.
Wow.
It was in print for 28 years, I think. And gosh, I'd go in the most remote places out here in the West, and I'd go into a gas station, and there'd be a little pile of Amato publications, and there was that book. It just kept on going. Yeah. And, sometimes I don't give I give very few talks anymore, but when I do, guys will come up and want me to sign a book. And it's not blue water fly fishing or steelhead fly fishing. It's that old book, Steelhead Fly-Fishing and Flies, and it kind of set this. It gave the sport some sort of tradition in terms of who the movers and shakers were, and the guys who developed the flies, who Jim Prey was, and the Eel River optics and that sort of stuff, and old time stuff. But I was pleased in that it gave it set the traditions of steelhead fly fishing down in print, and as a starting point for for future books and future writing and stuff. So that was very successful. I was pleased over that.
Yeah. Well, and before that, what was there as far as publications, or what were you drawing on to get your information and dig into everything?
I was going to Seattle Library. I went up there, made a couple trips to Seattle Library, go to a parking place and pay $1 to have my car parked all day. And I go in, and I was going through old Field and Stream magazines and stuff. And then I discovered that there was a newspaper called Forest and Stream, which was, I think, the predecessor for Field and Stream. Oh, okay. But it was like a newspaper, and it came out on a weekly basis, or maybe once every 2 weeks. And so I had one of these copies out, and in those days, if you Xeroxed, it was like $0.10 a copy, and it was black with white lettering. Really weird. But so the librarian said, we've got a complete record of this Forest and Stream. Wow. And there's only one other place in the Western United States, or only one other place in the world that has such an inventory. And I couldn't believe it, because this was a gold mine. That's where I started coming up with the names of John Ben and 19th century fly fishermen and the flies they fished.
Right.
Ben's coachman, that sort of thing. So I spent the next year, every Saturday, I was teaching school. I just started teaching school, and every Saturday I'd drive up to Seattle from Port Townsend, take the ferry across, go to that library. Excuse me, I misspoke. I drove up from Tacoma.
Oh, yeah.
And I would spend the day reading through these magazines, and then Xeroxing a few copies, and then go the following week. And after a year, I'd kind of tracked down the development of Western angling.
Wow.
From this magazine, because in those days there was a lot of fishing clubs. Big one was the Golden Gate Fishing Club, and there was a San Francisco one. Anyway, these were big time stuff, and these guys had a monthly newsletter that would be just like a Gillies report, at your meetings of your fly club.
Right.
And but they posted these every couple of weeks in Forest and Stream, or every month in Forest and Stream, and it was kind of a gossipy thing. It was wonderful, and it laid the groundwork for. So that was really where we didn't have Google, didn't have the internet. No. I contacted people who were still living by phone calls. Mm-hmm. There were still some old timers in California that were still around, and I made arrangements to meet them, and then I'd grab my camera and drive down and meet them and interview them and take some pictures and head back home. And so that's how Steelhead Fly Fishing and Flies came about. By the time I got into another book after that, we did have computers, and it made editing, especially editing, was much easier. But no, that's great. The Steelhead Trout is definitely. I mean, I've got all those books on my shelf, but I think that would be the one I'd have you sign, is the Steelhead Trout, because I think that's just a classic. And the fact that was your first book, I didn't even kind of forgot about that. That's really cool. I think the one that was, other than Steelhead Fly Fishing Flies, the one that was most groundbreaking was one that is most people in Steelhead don't even know that I even wrote it, was Blue Water Fly Fishing. Yeah. Which was the first treatment of worldwide of offshore fly fishing for big game fish. And that took me, I wasn't working on a book to do it, but it just the events as they unfolded, in the business I was in, which was I was charter master at for San Diego's Fisherman Landing for offshore fly fishing, and I chartered a Shogun and Royal Star, and but from there I went to Australia and New Guinea and South America. I think I was the first one on the west coast of Colombia to ever take a sailfish on a fly. Wow. But fly fished out of Panama. It's just all over the world. Yeah. And I got about halfway through those destinations, and I realized, with a few key spots, I could put together a book. Let me just back up a second. Yeah. This is kind of weird, but long time ago, in the course of steelhead fly fishing, some of the bar talk we had would be, it was evident to guys who were getting into saltwater big game fishing, there weren't very many of us, but it was evident that we were finding out where the baby marlin were in the world. There were places where marlin concentrated as juveniles. And for the first time, it was possible. I mean, there's no point in a guy with a fly rod going after a 500-pound black marlin. Right. But if you get a 50-pound or a 75-pound black marlin, that's really doable with a fly rod. You can take that fish down in real quick. So the one place that there's a river that flows out of the north coast of Australia, and the baby marlin hang off that affluent from the river, and the bait fish it attracts. That's where they grow up. It's a nursery for black marlin. That sort of thing got to be known. And, if you could stitch it together, if you could get to those places and you got lucky, you could, in fact, start running up the number of offshore billfish that you could get on a fly. And that's what happened. I mean, I got a black marlin off of Cape Bowling Green, Australia, and so forth. So yeah, that's it was kind of a parlor game of, now we know where, like, there's baby blues are extremely rare. It's hard to find them, but they are off Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. Whites are off Venezuela and so forth. So anyway, that's wow. So that was kind of about halfway through that book where I thought, it's possible to actually write a book on this subject without going bankrupt.
Gosh,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's one of the stories. I think when I was listening to you on Anchored with April on her show, you started talking about some of this stuff, and and it just blew me away, because I, like probably a lot of people, don't even realize that you have this whole other end of your fly fishing career where you're all this blue water stuff, which is amazing. And you told a story, I think, about, was it building your first boat, or you had a large boat? Maybe you can quickly, or just tell us a little bit about that. Was that the case? You kind of had something you worked on for a while?
Oh, yeah. In Port Townsend, there's two places in the United States that have famous wooden boat building schools. One's in Port Townsend, the other's in Maine. And as a young teacher in Port Townsend, I mean, the town was insane for sailboats. That was the environment. Not so much today, but it was back then. And I was just obsessed with getting a sailboat. I had no plans of building one or getting one as large as I ended up with. But it's a long story, and it went through a guy that bankrupted himself to get a boat, and it was a mess. But I ended up spending 3 years working every day except 2 days building a sailboat, and I could never have done that had I not been able to learn from guys who were teachers at the wooden boat, the School of Wooden Boat Building there. And they did some of the work for me, and then also taught me, how to build an inside of a sailboat. And it's slow. It's not complicated. It's slow because you're not dealing with any right angles. You're dealing, everything's got curves to it. Yeah. But we got her done, and the boat eventually sold the boat to. Sailed the daylights out of the boat, went to Alaska several times with the boat, but the son of one of the founders of Nike paid me cash for the boat when I put it up for sale. Oh, no kidding. It's still in Gig Harbor. Yeah, it's still in Gig Harbor, and still is in yacht shape. Yeah, it's maintained as a nice yacht. What
was her? Did she have a name?
Yeah, Shearwater.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I named my boats after birds. Oh, cool. I had a race. Shearwater was my cruising sailboat. I had a race boat that I raced in Transpac called Blue Jay. So yeah. Well, I think if anybody wants to hear more of that, the story how you described, because there are some really funny parts of that whole history, and they could check out the Anchored, like I said, the podcast with April to hear some of that, hear you talk about that. But I did want to get back into a little more on the just some of the history of steelhead fishing and flies and things like that. Can you do us kind of a breakdown of just the history of steelhead flies, maybe kind of a minute or two or whatever to for those that don't know kind of where they came from? And I know the whole Atlantic salmon, flies and things like that, but maybe just a quick rundown on that. We got into the Norwegian influence or the Scandinavian influence of tube flies. We're just talking about flies tied on hooks, and the fly patterns, the fly dressings that came from the eastern United States were really colorful brook trout flies, and they were taken out the west. The locals made them a little larger. Most of the stores either had flies tied locally or they ordered them from United Kingdom outlets. But and then things like the scarlet ibis, the coachman, the royal coachman. I mean, if you look at a coachman, you're looking at a skunk. So those flies made it to the western United States, and the center of the earliest time of steelhead fly fishing was came out of the Bay Area in San Francisco, north, and the first major rivers were the rivers north of San Francisco and the Eel. That was really where it began.
Yeah, and then it's kind of slowly worked its way up, kind of up north.
Yeah. Yeah, there was another. I mean, the centers of steelhead fly fishing were that jump-started the sport were summer run rivers.
Yeah,
where the fish were really much more free rising than winter fish.
Right,
and they were below very distinguished feeder streams that were spawning tributaries for that river. So Washington fly fishers congregated on the North Fork of the Stille for one-year ocean fish, and they built all their cabins below the confluence of Deer Creek. A steamboat, the famous North Umpqua, was only a couple blocks of pools. I mean, there's pools that are only 25 feet long that have a history, and they're that whole run is a collection point for summer run steelhead that are sitting there breathing in the cooler water from Steamboat Creek. So in terms of, in fact, I was on the phone this morning talking to a guy about what jump-started steelhead fly fishing, and I was introduced to this book by Bill Bakke, but the best book that we ever had, say in 1970, the best book we ever had that was in terms of steelhead fly fishing was Lee Wolf's book called The Atlantic Salmon. It was the whole book was about the Maritimes. It was inexpensively produced. The pictures were muddy. The ink drained into the cheap paper as a production book that was dreadful. But it was the first time we got into waking flies, hitching flies. There was so much stuff in that book that applied to steelhead fly fishing, and it transitioned steelhead fly fishing just overnight into a whole nother sport. It was incredible. And Bill Bakke was the one that said, you got to get this book. And when I got it, I could see why. Just hitching flies, for example, was mind-blowing. That for the first time we were swinging wet flies that instead of just wobbling in the current, if you wanted to, you could get them to break through the current and create a V wake. Totally different fly to a fish who sees the bubbles coming up. Applies to saltwater too. I mean, a marlin has the same appeal to a popper that is pushing out bubbles to the side. They don't rise to the popper; they rise to the bubbles. And steelhead are the same way. So, the transition was from little fixed wing flies, from brook trout to then hair wings, and then 30 years ago the sport went nuts because we had tube flies that were made of copper, tube flies made of plastic. The sport just went in terms of the flies, and we of course got intruders. It's what started me on this book that I'm working on now is 7 or 8 years ago. I was on a run on the Lower Quinault. We were setting up at a friend from Japan who I fish with every year, Bill Higashi. And Bill and I and Jack were on a run on the Quinault. And we had a couple guys paying clients along. And I was looking down this run, and not one single person was fishing any kind of conventional fly. There were some squid rows, there were some intruders, there was this, there's that. Nothing in a traditional wet fly where you tie the fly on a hook. And it had changed really dramatically in just about 10 years. It had so changed. So I kind of wanted to get into that. And then, when you get this far along in your writing, there's an opportunity to do some reflecting too on where the sport has gone and the loss of so many runs of steelhead, just tragic. So on the one hand, it's a history I wanted to write about. On the other hand, it's kind of depressing to get write about lost runs of steelhead every day. It's not the happiest way to start your day, but
yeah, exactly.
So anyway, that's where I'm kind of stuck on that right now. The book is the second half of the book is built around the four main drainages and the issues of preserving steelhead in those drainages. And one would be the Sacramento San Joaquin, which I mentioned. The Columbia is another.
Yep.
With the loss of the North Fork as kind of the centerpiece. The largest steelhead we ever had in the lower 48 states for this country were North Fork, Clearwater steelhead.
Yeah.
They're extinct. They're gone.
Right.
And in fact, they recycle hatchery fish at the Dvorak hatchery. They don't even make an attempt to preserve any part of that gene pool. And then the Fraser, and of course the tributary of the Fraser that is causing so much consternation and grief among steelhead fly fishers, the Thompson, and then the Skeena.
Yep.
And I've been in touch with Bob Hooten. Bob Hooten and I go back at least 30 years. When I first met him, he was managing the hatchery on the Stamp River on Vancouver Island, and then he went up to the Skeena and turned that whole place upside down on behalf of steelhead, and kind of became a legend up there. But so I'm going to certainly I've used his fine book and emails from Bob and phone interviews that will put together the issues that are imperiling steelhead runs on the Skeena.
Right.
But the Skeena is a happy story compared to the Thompson and the Columbia and certainly the Sacramento San Joaquin, which is just catastrophic.
Right. Yeah, I've spent.
So that's the second half of the. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Oh no, I was just gonna say the Skeena is a place I've spent a little time, and I know I've heard. Seems like runs have been kind of down throughout all of the Pacific Rim for steelhead, and you hear the stories about more pressure and things like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work for all of us to do to make sure, like that next generation. You've been, you've laid the groundwork, but there's a lot of people we need to get the word out to, that conservation message and stuff. So no, I appreciate you spending the time to do that.
The Canadian government bought out all the boats and the nets and the fishermen and stuff on the maritime rivers like the Rishtagooch and the Miramichi. That's a no-brainer. That was so simple because the fish are worth so much more as a sports fish than as a food fish.
Yeah.
But we've got a mixed stock fishery, and the Thompson is a prime example of the first Thompson fish that start homing in to the Fraser to go up the Thompson. And I've told people, emotionally I consider the Thompson River and where it is and the way it looks and the size of its fish in keeping with the Norway's Alta, which is far and away the most expensive river in the world. I mean, you're talking $5,000 or $10,000 a day to fish the river.
Jeez.
But if you can get on, you might have to wait 2 lifetimes just to get on the, to get membership. And I think membership now is $700,000 to be a member. But anyway, the mixed stock fishery, you've got a few hundred Thompson steelhead that are heading for the Fraser and going down the inside passages and going down the outside of Vancouver Island and coming through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But most of them today are coming down the inside, and they're coming down with potentially millions of sockeye that are heading for the Adams River to spawn. So we're talking a retail business in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And you're talking a handful of Thompson steelhead by a small number of fly fishers. And when you're weighing that, the hundreds of millions of dollars against the interest of a few fly fishermen, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The huge dollar value that is attached to commercial fishing just bulldozes special interests like steelhead fly fishing just it's going to get blown over. And sadly, that's what's happened.
Yeah.
I don't think that, your interest as a fly fisherman are going to be secondary to the interest of an entire industry. We're talking about boats and banks and schools.
Yeah.
And Native First Family Canadians and Native Americans, and it's embedded in the economy. Is the fishing dollars that they get, and it's so difficult to get the save the steelhead from special interest. And in the case of the Thompson, I think you're gonna lose. I think the Thompson steelhead, perhaps the largest steelhead in the history of this planet, are going to be lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the rundown this year is what, 150, 200 fish. That's it.
Yeah.
Where the run was once, we talked about this earlier, the run was once 25, 30,000.
30,000. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be
back in the Depression.
Right. It's going to be a struggle for sure. Yeah. Well, I guess there's, I think of it starts with a small group. I mean, obviously there's a lot of challenges, but I think, again, you getting the word out, and slowly, maybe you do lose that run or that, that whole system. But, I guess we just got to keep going forward and, getting the word out. But you've thrown out, Trey, a lot of, as we've been talking here, a lot of great big names and, people that have made fly fishing what it is. Who are a few of your mentors or, people that have helped you along the way that, really stick out in your life?
Well, back in the day when I was just getting started, Frank Amato gave me a huge break. I saw Frank's, I think it was the second issue of Salmon Trout Steelhead in a newsstand, and I was shaking like a leaf. I called him and said, I'd done all this research about all these fishing flies, and could I send him an article on? He said, "Sure, send it to me, and I'll publish it if it's publishable." Mm-hmm. So I typed out on a Olympic typewriter this little short piece on this fly, and I think the fly was the Parmachene Belle, but anyway. Mm-hmm. And Frank said, "Okay, I'll publish the article," and my payment for the article was $5. And Frank was bagging groceries at the supermarket to make money, make the money to be able to get that first issue and that second issue done. And then he just made enough money to be able to justify another one and then another one. And it was a struggle. I mean, Frank and I go way back. Huh. And he kind of started a second magazine, long since forgotten, but Bill Bakke was a visionary as far as being anti-hatchery and pro-native fish and pro-wild fish and so forth. And so Frank and Bill, I owe them a lot. They were Frank from the publishing standpoint, and of course he's very knowledgeable about fishing issues. And Bakke was the first time I heard, Bakke would rail against plastic fish and hatcheries. Mm-hmm. And if you're a Washingtonian, hatcheries are just part of the scene. You just accept the fact that hatcheries are a gift from the gods. You just go with it. Right. And Bakke was the first one that it was like blasphemy, no, the hatcheries suck. I mean, we should not have any. We should be preserving the environment and promoting runs of wild fish. And 50 years later, Bill was spot on. I mean, and everybody knows the hatcheries ultimately lead to practically the destruction of not just the gene pool, but the fish itself. I mean, let me digress just for a quick second here. I wrote a long chapter of the book, and I published it as an article in Tom Buys the Drake. But the Quinault has got a hatchery, and they have two hatchery programs, and one is a classic terminal fishery for a food fish for steelhead, and they just recycle hatchery fish, and it's federally funded. the government's involved, and they reproduce the fish as cheaply as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the fish are like 5, 6, 7 pounds.
Yep.
The native Quinault fish is like a fire plug. It is really massively built fish. It's like looking at a Kispiox or a Babine fish.
Jeez.
And then the other hatchery, they have been selectively breeding for 3 and 4 year ocean fish for 40 some years. And they net, like they'll pull a fish still alive out of their nets and they read the scales right there on the water, and they will only select 3 year ocean fish. Now, this is not an advocacy of any particular hatchery program, but these hatchery fish, which are, they will cross a wild fish with a 3 year hatchery returning fish. And the fish average 13 to 17 pounds approximately. Yeah. And they have hatchery returns every year, half a dozen hatchery returning fish, bucks that are over 30 pounds.
Jeez.
It's not advertised. They don't bring it up. The Quinaults do it out of kind of tribal bragging rights between the tribes and stuff.
Yeah.
But Bakke was the first one that the practices that are exercised by the hatcheries where they just recycle hatchery fish, Bill knew half a century ago that was an absolute dead end. Mm-hmm. And no one was easily persuaded because we practically invented mitigation for every kind of environmental disaster you can create, but essentially dams. Build a dam and build a hatchery for mitigation. Yep. And the whole Columbia River is set up that way.
Yeah, it is.
But so Frank and Bakke.
Okay. Those are two. Yeah.
Tremendously influential people in my life, and I owe both those guys a lot. And Frank got me going in being able to publish my stuff, my articles, and things like that, and gave me an opportunity to publish the first few books. It was, I was fortunate.
Yeah, no, those are huge. I mean, Frank definitely. I've got a good Frank Amato story I'll have to tell another time where we dumped a boat in the river, and Frank was one of the only guys with a sled on the river, and he picked us up and helped pick up our pieces as our gear floated down the river. But yeah, no, that's awesome. Those guys are obviously big names. I was kind of thinking of a few as you were chatting there. About some of the people that influenced you. Do you do any guiding and teaching still to this day? Is that something I know you've obviously taught a lot of people through your writing, but do you actually guide or do any of that still?
No, I'll host and work with some clients for Jack out on the West End in the boat on the river. We introduced Steelhead Fly-Fishing to a number of Japanese guys. Mm-hmm. I've done that. Yeah. The long-range fly fishing was a job. I mean, that was an occupation I had, and it made more money than I could have ever in a million years made guiding for steelhead. Yeah. Even if I had my own lodge. But it was intensely hands-on, and I instructed the crew and so that everything was IGFA legal. I lost count out of how many world records we got on those trips, but it would be a couple hundred.
Wow.
And I saw during those years, I did this for 11 or 12 years, I saw over 1,000 striped marlin hooked on flies. And we developed methods to beat those fish down faster than it had ever been done before. I mean, we could take a 100-pound marlin down in under 10 minutes. And it was like, it wasn't, it wasn't warfare. It was more like a ballet. Where you put the screws to the fish. But But anyway, where was I? I was kind of wandering there.
Oh,
sorry,
no, I've been wandering a little bit too. I've got like 50 questions. I could sit here and talk to you for another 3 hours probably. But no, this has been good. We've been. I love getting into the history and hearing your background. I think it makes a lot of sense.
The question was,
yeah.
The question was, do I guide? And there's a if you just take a guy out for a day on the river and he falls in the river and drowns, you'll be bankrupted for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So I've always, when I did the long range fly fishing, I was protected under the insurance that Fisherman's Landing carried and the owner of the boat carried on the boat.
Okay.
When I'm with Jack, the liability is with Jack. So I worked under, Jack's independent guides, they're independent business people, but there's some sort of protection that they have also in that regard. But just grabbing somebody and taking them to the river, I just have not done that.
Yeah.
And there's at this point I'm too old to do it, and I haven't been able to fish myself until I get my back fixed.
That's right.
But anyway, so I'm working with Jack. We set up this Indian program on the Quinault Indian Nation waters, first of its kind, swing only, very successful for a few years, and combination of a pretty aggressive netting and just a downturn in the runs. When we had the last year I was out there, the fishing was very, very poor on the Quinault.
Yeah.
The Queets was pretty good.
Okay. Most
people are not aware that the Queets Indians pull their nets. They pull their nets on Thursday about noon. Mm-hmm. They just they're no longer anchored. They just swing against the bank, and they don't put them back in until Monday at noon. Mm-hmm. So I've been on that river where when those nets are pulled Thursday at noon, the fish are coming. The fish that are timed on the tide, 3 miles, 2 miles above tide water, those fish are already up there. There is not a mark on them that is rose colored. Yeah, they are. They are absolutely ocean bright, gorgeous fish. Wow. And so Friday, you get on the river Friday, and they're already beyond the reservation, and they're in public water by then. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Wow, that's awesome.
So yeah,
I'm going to try to. That's one place, the OP, I haven't been out to yet. So I'm hopefully going to get out this year and check out some of the country because obviously you hear a lot of amazing things about that area. So what
the other guy I was thinking about, just real quickly, I should mention it. There's a lot of guys that have influenced me because of the book Steelhead Fly-Fishing. There was a profile of a lot of anglers in that book. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Harry Lemire. Everybody does. Yeah. I spent a good deal of time. Harry had a lot of friends closer to him than I was, but I certainly I spent a good amount of time with Harry. Sometimes made him on the Skagit. I had a little Lumadrifter jet, little 15-foot jet engine, so I didn't have to hitchhike my way back. I could run back to the launch, and I'd run Harry up to the sock. But he was pretty shrewd in how he would develop water and rate it and find small holding places and not share that. I mean, there was a reason why he oftentimes would find a fish where other people could not, and it was because he had small slots of water that he knew would hold a fish here or a fish there periodically. Yeah. And the man was an absolute treasure and also a gifted fly tar. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's a lot of guys. Some of the guys that I profiled in the book were I learned a great deal from. Yeah. Lemire was just one of many. Okay, Bill McMillan comes to mind, of course. He's a very talented guy.
And I'll be
go ahead. No, it's fine.
Yeah, I was going to note that I'll post some, for all the stuff we're talking about, as far as links in the show notes, just so people can, if they're not familiar with, some of the information or names. I mean, obviously these are all big names you're talking about, but I'll try to do my own research and provide some good links so people can look up some of the history there as well. But yeah, like I said, Trey, I had a bunch of questions, but we're kind of getting down, to the end of the show here. I've got a few more I want to definitely talk to you about, and one of them was, I get a lot of questions about the two-handed rods and things like that. When did you make that what was that transition like for you? Because you kind of steelhead fishing at one point was kind of, it was a single-handed thing. How did that all come about for you?
I was getting a lot of rods from Orvis, and I went from getting rods from Orvis to getting rods from Sage. Mm-hmm. But the first two-handed rod I got was way back in the day was from Orvis. It was a lousy rod. But back then we made our own lines. Yeah. And Dave, the lines we made were like today's wind cutters. Yeah. This is so stupid because upon reflection, everybody would go like, well, duh, of course. But the line, the parent line, the major line, has got to have more grains per foot in it than the sink tip. Mm-hmm. Once we got that through our thick skulls, then we could make beautiful casting lines by getting saltwater long belly lines and cutting most of the line away and using 10 meters of forward taper that would be, 10 feet of front taper, 8 feet of front taper, and the rest of it was a big fat line. And then to that, you'd tie in your sink tip. And as long as there was no place in that connection where you're running from, say, 10 grains per foot, I'm just making this up, but running 10 grains per foot into 15 grains, it just doesn't work. In fact, scientific anglers made a horrible line that they named a steelhead line of some sort, in which the running line weighed nothing, and everything was in the sink tip, and it was like having a cat of nine tails in your hand. But so we made our own lines. Bob York was the first one that drew a diagram out for me and showed me the kinds of lines that he was making for his own personal use. And I just created the same line, a little bit bigger, a little bit longer for a two-handed rod. And then I had switched and started fishing sage rods. But from that point on, I never went back to a single-handed rod for steelhead. It was too easy to cover water. Yep. Too easy to... I really got into the grease line fishing where you lead your fly instead of back mending all the time. Yep. And so that the fly would swing broadside to the current and would stay down. It would you weren't back mending it so that it wanted to pull up from its run. But as soon as I did that, I never went back. And back then, a 14-foot rod was considered pretty petite, pretty lightweight, small. Everybody I knew, I fished with Jimmy Honeycutt and Jim Vincent, and those guys were swinging 16-foot rods. That was big time stuff. It's that was fun. When we got on to making our own lines, we couldn't buy any lines that were worth a crap. No. They had these long-bellied lines were horrible to cast and try to work out. But our own handmade lines were a dream, and I think Jimmy for Rio just in effect kind of took what was already out there and formally got some investors for Rio and produced the wind cutter, and it was a sensational line. But, anyway, go ahead. I know you're.
I'm hammered. I got some more questions to dig in here, but no, that is, I always love hearing that. So another one I always love to throw out there is just on flies. I know there's, everybody has their favorite flies they use or whatever. Are there a couple of steelhead flies that are the first one that you throw on there when you're fishing?
For summer run, I've always liked the Night Dancer. The combination of black, purple, and red. And a couple years ago, I was talking to Frank, and he'd caught 8 or 10 winter run one day, all on the Night Dancer tied with some spay hackle, which we can now get. The Chinese are now sending marketing heron hackle.
Oh, really?
They're most of the heron, I think they've got so much fish farming in China that the heron around the fish farms, were shooting them.
Yep.
And they had all these feathers, and then now they've got a market for the feathers. I don't know how it all happens, but yeah. So
yeah, and that Night Dancer is, I think that's a motto, is one of his patterns, right?
It is. Yeah. And then my favorite really super dirty water fly was a version of Bill McMillan's Winter Hope.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But it was tied in marabou, in which the yellow is down the center and then is flanked with orange. But the combination of Silver Doctor Blue and purple is the most high vis. One color superimposed on the other is so high vis that you can see it in water that you can almost plow. I've caught steelhead with that in water that was so dirty. But and I've got some of my own orange patterns that I use, usually with marabou. But most of my stuff today, I have my own tube flies. Yeah. That there's a series of flies that I've been using called Steel Flash, and especially for summer run with a size 4 or a 6 hook on there, I watch steelhead come 25 feet away and hammer those flies. So they're starting just now getting out on the market in a commercial.
And what was the name? What was the name again of that pattern?
Steel Flash.
Steel Flash.
All one word. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I'll try to find.
And I've got the one I use most often is a black and purple Steel Flash fly. Okay. And it's weighted up front with small chrome barbell eyes that I paint with red glitter paint. Oh yeah. And I know that sounds crazy, but I can see the red head. I can see it out in the river on the swing. Yep. It's makes sense. Red glitter shows up like a lantern. Yeah. Yeah. So not very traditional. Yeah. It sure works.
Cool. Yeah, I'll try to find some photos of those and provide links so people can take a look. As far as somebody getting into it, I'm always trying to find a tip or two for people new to steelhead fly fishing. Do you have something you'd tell somebody who is just getting into steelhead fishing?
Find a run or 2 runs or 3 runs, walk in that you can get into, walk and wade, and know that run at all water levels, and know that run intimately, and how the fish move through the run. And I think it's more profitable, more successful to know a couple runs extremely well than it is to get into a boat and float 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 miles for the day. Yep. And try to make a cast here and make a cast there. And most of your day is spent traveling. That's right. And you're on water that you do not know that well. Yep. When we fished the Quinault Indian Nation water, there was a couple runs that I knew so well. I mean, I knew every pebble in the run, and I was guiding the Japanese, and I could move a guy in that run to a spot and I would tell him exactly where to cast, and it would swing through there. And if there was a steelhead in that run, that guy would hook it. Yeah. And I think Lemir's approach was the same. The runs he knew, and he knew, God knows how many more runs than he knew than I would ever know. But his approach was the same. Yeah. He did not head on down the river, bang a cast here, bang a cast there, this run, that run. The runs he was on, he knew really, really well. And I think that's also in a European approach where they're using a beat system where you've got maybe a 1 mile, maybe you've got 3 or 4 kilometers of river you're fishing, and you know that extremely well, as opposed to the American would feel like that he's at a disadvantage being confined to that short length of river. Yep. But really not so. If the fish are moving through, he may come upon the runs that he's going to be fishing, and they're going to be empty of fish on that particular day. But generally, year in and year out, that would be that would be the way I'd go. I'd know I'd have a few runs, and there's a few runs on the Klickitat here that are really good. And knowing a couple of those runs super well is you're going to have more success than trying to cover a whole lot of water.
It is. It's a great point, and something I definitely struggle at too sometimes, because I love getting the drift boat out there and floating the rivers. But yeah, that is a great point to really just focus and learn the run. Yeah, I've got a couple more here, quick ones, Trey. This is kind of one I have been thinking about for you, because I think you've done a lot in your career. As far as, just kind of being remembered, what you'd like to be remembered for in fly fishing. Does anything pop out in your mind, down the line when we're all gone and 2 generations from now, people are still fly fishing, hopefully for the steelhead that are have recovered. What comes to your mind?
2 things, 2 very different things. One would be that I was able to record and write about the early pioneers in steelhead fly fishing, and get that down and give the sport its heroes, the people that everybody from Jim Cray to Zane Grey. To give you to record who those guys were and what flies they fished, the traditions that they established. I would say that. I mean, every sport, you don't have a sport if you don't have some sort of tradition. Your heroes, your people that were pivotal in the development of the sport. That's what makes it a sport, not an activity. So I would say that, and then the treatment of blue water fly fishing. That was a book so far ahead of its time, and with the oceans filling with commercial boats, especially the Taiwanese and the Chinese and so forth, it is going to be increasingly hard to find schools of offshore game fish that are not being are not being caught for. I mean, the demand for fish is increasing constantly.
Right.
I started catching sailfish in Costa Rica in the mid '80s, and by the mid '90s, the commercial guys were already coming in, and our fishing dropped off so dramatically. Back in those days, those were some of the largest sailfish in the world. I mean, there were weeks I had down at Bahia Pez Vela Lodge, just south of the Nicaraguan border, that were averaging 115 pounds. Those are big sails. That's gone. I mean, that is because the resource is being plundered by commercial interest, and the largest concentration of marlin in the world is found off of Baja, California, about 3/5 of the way down.
Okay.
Thousands concentrate there before they head on down to Cabo. And we knew they were there, and we fished for them for years. But that got beat up too. Sooner or later, I mean, the commercial boats are going to move in there. One generation ago, they were in there for yellowfin. Now, with the yellowfin stocks depleted, they go in there and get the marlin.
Jeez.
So anyway, I think the book was ahead of its time, and I'm not sure that a person could, for any amount of money, a person could do that today. Yeah. Just because the resources, the availability of the resources is not there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true for I mean, it's true for steelhead, and like you said before, things have changed a lot. So what do you have going for like the next 6 months? Anything you want to note for everybody here? They can check out any projects. Sounds like you have that book. That's kind of your big project.
I'm going to do an article for Tom By, the Drake. On the Thompson. My take on it. It's not it's just like this is what's happening. And this is why the fish are becoming extinct, and this is why the government will probably allow the run of fish in the Thompson to go its way. Real quickly, I know you're pressed for time, but real quickly, the Thompson steelhead are in the Alaska fishery, and those you cannot legally take steelhead in the Alaska fishery, so fish buyers won't buy it. When they're pulled out of the nets, you can either keep them or you can throw them back in the ocean. But there's no record of any steelhead being caught in the Alaskan fishery. When the Thompson fish get off of the coast of British Columbia, and they're caught by either Washington guys offshore or the Canadian guys closer to the beach. Those fish are protected and they're dumped back in the ocean, but they don't exist. They're a total pain in the ass for the commercial fishing industry to have to deal with, and they will not deal with them.
Yep.
So there's no record of those fish being caught. And when they enter the Fraser, they're in the company of millions of sockeye, and Washington State and British Columbia commercial guys at the entrance to the Fraser nets those sockeye stocks. And when they take Thompson fish, they can't sell them. So the fish go unrecorded.
Wow.
And you don't know how many have been caught. And when they, by September and October, the First Family Canadians, the Indians, have got their nets set for chums because of a super rapidly expanding roe. They call it Keta caviar,
that's right,
the species name for Oncorhynchus. And so the Keta caviar is shipped to Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Australia, to sushi bars all over the world.
Yep.
Although the Eastern Russian and the Japanese do have runs of, I think, chums and cherry salmon. But anyway, and so the steelhead, they are noted. If the natives take a steelhead in their net and the steelhead is still alive, they'll throw it out of the net and into the river so the fish can continue.
Yeah.
The mortality of the fish is unknown, and there's no required record that they note the steelhead. So you go right on from the beginning to the end. There's no record of what's happening to the Thompson steelhead, except at the end there are no steelhead.
Right.
So that is what is frustrating and depressing.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that is a challenge. So I'll write about that for the Drake, I hope.
Okay.
That would be my next project, and I'm going to go out the West End. This surgery I've got is a quick turnaround.
Okay.
It's not like a full-on back. It's just two vertebrae that are totally degenerated. Yep. So I'll go out there with Jack, and I'll host some friends. I think I've got some guys coming from Japan again.
Yep.
And we'll give it a whirl in March.
Okay.
Out on the Quinault. I'd love to get on the Queets again. I love that river. So if the river's not running too dirty. So, yeah.
Good stuff. All right. Well, good luck with the surgery. And before I let you go, is there a place I can that people that are listening to this can find you if they want to ask you questions or just kind of pick your brain?
I've got a new email address, which is complicated. It was done for security, so I couldn't get hacked, and it was handled by a company, and they gave me a new email address. It's kind of complicated.
Oh, okay.
It's trey.combs1897.
Yep.
At pt-mail .com. .net, excuse me.
.net. Perfect.
I think it's .net.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it is.
But I'll give you my phone number. If a guy wants to call and then shoot me a trial email, then I'll send him back, and then the guy's locked into my email address.
Perfect.
But it's 509-369-1025. 1025. And I am in Klickitat at least. I'll be in Klickitat for the next year.
Okay.
I'm remodeling this house.
Okay.
I'm not doing much right now because I'm going to spend most of 2018 completing this book.
Yeah.
And getting it out from underneath it. I've got a couple other projects I want to get involved with, and the book is taking up most of my time. Good.
Well, that sounds like it's always good to keep busy. So good. I'll provide links to your email and phone here in the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And
thanks, Dave.
Trey, I appreciate you coming on. This has been really exactly what I was hoping to get out of it. A lot of hearing about the history, but there's so much more I want to ask you. So maybe I could catch up with you here in a year or so, and we can kind of do a kind of fill in the blanks. the questions I missed.
Maybe you're too much.
Yeah. Okay.
We can do a part 2 on this. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Trey, for coming on, and we'll see you soon.
Dave, thank you, and good luck to you.
Okay.
And good luck on this project of your podcast. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, sir.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah. Take care.
So there you have it. If you want to connect with Trey, go to wetflyswing.com and just search for Trey Combs. The show notes with Trey's email and his phone number to connect with him will be in those show notes. And I want to say thanks again for stopping by today to check out the show. It's been great to connect with Trey, and I hope to see you soon and maybe even see you on the river. Please leave a comment in iTunes and let me know how I'm doing with the show. That would be much appreciated. So I'll catch you very soon and see you on the flip side.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.